Ancient Sparta is frequently viewed as a unique political entity among all other ancient Greek city-states, a perception held not only by contemporary audiences but also by its own people and rival polities. Numerous factors are cited as evidence of Sparta's divergence from the rest of the Greek world, ranging from their supposed austere lifestyle and their state-controlled land ownership system to their intensely militarized society. However, this idealized view of Sparta obscures a much more complicated truth, a phenomenon that French classicist François Ollier termed the Spartan mirage. Behind centuries of Spartan propaganda that promoted the idea of Spartan uniqueness lies a reality that shows Sparta was still very much a typical Greek city-state, similar to all the others. In this episode, we will debunk several myths about Sparta's exceptionalism, including their purported lack of artistic expression and luxury. Along the way, we will examine both the ways in which Sparta truly stood apart and the many ways in which the Lacedaemonians closely resembled their Hellenic counterparts. So was Sparta genuinely a unique state? Did it possess wealth, poetry, and other cultural practices akin to those found throughout the rest of the Hellenic world? And what exactly is the Spartan mirage? Welcome to our myth-busting video on Sparta, where we will discuss precisely how special it was within the broader context of classical Greek civilization. Spartan mirage and myths. Before we examine the Spartans and begin scrutinizing their culture, we must first grasp the concept of the Spartan mirage. The Spartan mirage is essentially the image of Sparta that persists in modern culture today, depicting a city of muscular warriors living austere communal lives solely dedicated to achieving enormous military strength. Because the Spartans themselves left behind minimal written documentation, this view of Sparta was initially crafted by outsiders from other parts of ancient Greece. These include the Athenian mercenary and historian Xenophon, as well as Thucydides, the Athenian who documented the Peloponnesian Wars fought between Athens and Sparta. Herodotus, for his part, characterized Sparta as an autocratic society that had more in common with the Persians than with their fellow Greeks. This perception of Sparta as a uniquely militaristic, communal, and austere society has endured throughout history. After the Romans conquered southern Greece, they converted Sparta into a tourist attraction, exploiting its supposed martial history to draw visitors. 1,000 years later, when European intellectuals began rediscovering the classical world, Enlightenment thinkers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau continued to perpetuate the myth of Sparta as a society of unconquerable monk-like warriors. However, in modern times, the Spartan mirage has been critically reviewed by scholars who have specialized in Sparta, such as Paul Cartledge and Stephen Hodkinson. With this context in mind, let us discover the true nature of Sparta. Spartan wealth and austerity. The most prominent myth surrounding Sparta is its supposed extreme austerity. In this view, promoted by ancient authors like the Greek philosopher Plato, the Spartans were a people who rejected extravagance and wealth, preferring simple lives. This monastic view of Spartan society potentially traces its origins back to the mythical lawgiver of ancient Sparta, Lycurgus, who supposedly decreed that his people use heavy, iron money as their main currency to prevent the Spartans from becoming corrupted by gold. This traditional example has recently been challenged by archaeologists and historians, who point out that Sparta was simply late in adopting minted coinage. Spartan origin coins appeared in significant quantities towards the end of the 5th century BCE and were made of silver. This development indicates that Sparta was not immune to using ordinary coins, and also used precious metals to create them. Furthermore, it suggests that political divisions existed within a city supposedly famous for its uniformity. Additionally, the myth that foreign currency was prohibited in Sparta does not stand up to scrutiny. The Spartan war chests for the Peloponnesian Wars against Athens in the 5th century BCE contained gold coins from other cities alongside other precious metals. A significant portion of this wealth.
Further evidence of the Spartans' access to material wealth includes the discovery of luxurious votive offerings in various rural shrines across Sparta, where substantial amounts of gold and silver offerings have been found. These lavish tributes to the gods demonstrate that, at least in matters of religion, Sparta had no reservations about wealth. In fact, some scholars, such as Stephen Hodkinson, assert that Sparta was quite unequal in terms of wealth and land tenure. Hodkinson's research has shown that, contrary to assumptions by ancient and modern authors, Sparta did not have communal property. Instead, Sparta, as a polis, had greater authority over land confiscation than other Greek cities, as well as specific land reserved for state use. Hodkinson argues that land tenure in Sparta was relatively unequal, with wealthier Spartans owning large farming estates managed by enslaved helots, and Spartans of humbler means owning smaller plots of land that they farmed themselves. The reality that Sparta was composed of many small settlements also confirms this reliance on farming, as these smaller communities often included farming estates. Land inequality was, in fact, a significant contributor to Spartan manpower shortages in the 4th century BCE. Sparta was traditionally a conservative city, preferring to maintain its own sphere of influence rather than engage in outward expansion. However, wealth inequality grew due to the concentration of power in large estates through inheritance laws, which favored owners who preferred a more luxurious lifestyle. Other families were forced to divide their land to the point of poverty, which had severe consequences for their social status. Several Spartan kings attempted to reverse this decline, but they consistently faced resistance from wealthy Spartan landowners determined to protect their wealth. This insight reveals Sparta to be much like other Greek cities, with inequality embedded within its community and economic structures. Spartan militarism and politics. Another aspect for which Sparta is considered unique is its militarism. This facet of Spartan life is by far its most famous, and it does contain elements of truth. For example, while all Greek cities required mandatory military service from their citizens, in Sparta it was a uniquely long obligation, lasting from the age of 20 to 60. Furthermore, most Spartan boys participated in a military training program known as the agoge from the ages of 7 to 20. Sparta was also unique because the state provided the military equipment for the Spartan infantry, whereas other cities required private citizens to fund their own gear. These examples might suggest greater state involvement in social affairs related to war, but Sparta was not a city organized by its military. In fact, Spartan public and military affairs were intended to be separate, both in terms of visibility and community ties. This is supported by the fact that public funerals for Spartan soldiers who died in battle were typically not held in Sparta, with the dead being buried near the battlefield where they fell. Other polis, like Athens, emphasized public funerals, but in Sparta, military funerals were rare. This avoidance of public mourning suggests that Spartan officials sought to keep the cost of war separated from civic society. Thus, war was not intended to be a direct concern for the average Spartan citizen, but a distant affair only discussed when strategy was debated in the Apella assembly. Some might argue against this by pointing out that Spartan life for men was defined by their attendance at communal meals known as the syssitia, which were organized based on military unit membership. However, these meals were actually both civic and military in nature, with eligibility based on both one's local residence and military status. Therefore, the syssitia only partially organized Spartan life around one's military regiment, and the atmosphere was likely much more akin to a Greek koinon, or club or association. These examples demonstrate that Sparta did indeed separate war from civic life, much like other cities. It lacked a public culture of mourning and had community organizations that were social in nature, even when they overlapped with military affairs.
There is also the case of Spartan politics, which many outsiders considered unique compared to the political systems of other Greek cities. The Spartan political system was distinctive among Greek systems due to its complexity. It included 2 kings, an assembly of elders known as the Gerousia, the 5 elected ephors, as well as the citizens' assembly known as the Apella. Each of these elements can be found individually in other Greek poli, but their combined presence in Sparta is somewhat unusual. Each Spartan institution was designed to balance the others and promote social harmony. In addition, Sparta was supposedly driven by social uniformity, aiming for no single citizen to become overly ambitious or lacking in moderation. This idea is evidenced by the name for the citizens, homoi, or similar ones. Consequently, Sparta's principles of mixed government and uniformity have led many authors to view the polis as uniquely politically unified. However, Spartan politics were just as polarizing as in any other Greek polis. For instance, in Herodotus's Histories, the Spartan king Cleomenes was accused of being insane and later turned up dead. What was officially recorded as a suicide has been suspected of being an assassination by the man who succeeded him as king, Leonidas, famous for the Battle of Thermopylae. This example of political murder shows that politicking and polarization were clearly present in Sparta. These myths of social harmony were propagated both by Laconophile, admirer of Sparta, authors, and the Spartans themselves, as they believed these enhanced Sparta's reputation. Despite this, Spartan politics were just as chaotic as the factional squabbling of any other Greek city. Spartan society and community. Sparta is also recognized for its unique social composition and community values. Social practices are another area where Sparta had some very distinct customs. For instance, women in Sparta were educated in both physical and mental matters. Moreover, as mentioned earlier, Sparta projected an image of uniformity, a belief that extended to sport. The Lacedaemonians were allegedly expected not to display ambition or individuality lest they fall into hubris, excessive pride. Enforcement of laws on matters such as sports supposedly enforced uniformity and austerity, as claimed by some authors, who suggested that the Spartans were not meant to celebrate athletic victories. In reality, archaeologists excavating Spartan shrines have discovered numerous examples of votive offerings with inscriptions that mention individual athletes in their accomplishments. These include statuettes or inscriptions that mention people by name and their accomplishments. The conclusion drawn from these private offerings is that Spartans could and certainly did celebrate individual achievements, and were not as slavishly conformist as we are led to believe. Another facet of Spartan society, often contrasted with that of other Greek cities, was the restrictiveness of its citizenship. Spartan citizenship typically required that both of one's parents be native Spartans. However, the notion that the Spartans were uniquely restrictive in their citizenship has been questioned by scholars such as Paul Cartledge. Citizenship in Sparta was subject to screening by elders and contingent on the ability to contribute to the collective meals known as the Syssidia. Despite these tests, it was also possible to become a citizen of Sparta if one was recruited into the Spartan military. These people, known as the neo-damogeis, were granted natural rights nearly equal to those of a native-born Spartan. Thus, the Spartans could be more flexible in their relations with foreigners than initially assumed by many authors and traditional scholars. Spartan religion and culture. The last aspect of Spartan life we will investigate is that of Spartan artwork. Indeed, when it came to creative expression, Sparta was far from the austere place that many of the myths about it would suggest. The artistic skill seen in the votive offerings mentioned above is also evident in the elaborate pottery and the architecture found in the city's settlements. Throughout Spartan history, Spartans patronized flashy art that was often utilized to showcase their status and prestige. In addition to material culture, there was also the written word. Although the Spartans left behind precious few written records, their citizens were literate and could appreciate poetry. Examples of local poets include the 7th century poet Tertius and his contemporary Alcman. Tertius's poetry focused on military glory, a fact clear in his elegy and iambus. Abide then, O young men, shoulder to shoulder and fight. Begin not foul flight, nor yet be afraid, but make the heart in your breasts both great and stout, and never shrink when you fight the foe. And the elder sort, whose knees are no longer nimble, fly not ye to leave them fallen to earth. Conclusion. Overall, the Spartans were often more intense in their application of traditional Greek institutions than their counterparts in Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and other parts of the Hellenic world. However, these institutions were very much present in other cities. There were some instances where Sparta was truly unique, such as their women having more extensive property rights and the length of their military service. However, these are outnumbered by other institutions that were fundamentally Greek. Like any idealized society viewed as part of a lost golden age, the reality of Sparta was far more complex than the myths it inspired. The Spartans were stubborn, elitist, and conservative, two characteristics that contributed to their eventual downfall. But despite their own and others' romanticized projections, they were very much Greek. This is the greatest lesson of Spartan history, that people create their own history, but not exactly as they wish.